We are in chapter 28 now. This is a chapter on something called protists. And this chapter, there's much information that's confusing because the information changes based on new research, new knowledge. And we will touch on that, but we'll try to not touch on it too. And then I will try to distill the information down into what is important for you to know at this level. What this is a very important group of organisms that lie somewhere between the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. And so the reason for the confusion with regard to research is at one time it was thought that they were in a kingdom all by themselves, but that theory has gone away because they do have membrane-bound organelles, but those organelles are not quite like eukaryotic organelles, but they definitely have membrane-bound organelles. And at one time, they didn't think they had mitochondria. Now they find they do have mitochondria, but it's just not as developed as the mitochondria we were looking for. So that's where the confusion is. And actually, we're going to keep talking about 4 supergroups, and even that tends to be a little confusing because many people, biologists, break it down into 5 supergroups. But we're sticking with what you have in your textbook and as far as what you're learning in Bio 101 and also as to what will be on the test. So throughout this chapter I will be talking about protists, and I will be talking about protist groups and trying to refer back to what you need to know for this particular class in terms of testing, etc., and hopefully make it very, very interesting for you. But anyway, what happens with regard to protists, they are a very important part of our biosphere because they can be either producers or they can be consumers. So they can be producers with regard to, producers with regard to secreting organic matter that can be absorbed by bacteria, then be used by plankton, or they can be used by plankton themselves, or you can actually have plankton that then is carnivores. It actually eats other plankton, so carnivore planktons that eat plant plankton or herbivore planktons, and then other consumers like really huge mammals that feed off the plankton. So at the bottom, I guess, or at the part of this whole food chain are these protists, these protist producers that secrete organic matter. So they're a very, very important part of the bio food chain of many animals and many different other types of species, living species. Most protists there are eukaryotes, don't get me wrong. I tried to start the conversation with they at one time were their own kingdom. Now they've brought into the eukaryotic kingdom. Most of them are single cell organisms. They do have organelles. They're more complex than prokaryotes. So prokaryotes are what we just talked about in chapter 27. Most of them are single cell, but there are some colonial type protists, and there are some multicellular protists species, but most are unicellular. It's an informal name, so I guess it's it's definitely informal, but it's the hold-all name at this point until this confusion gets worked out, and certainly it's a very good name for us to use in our class. So it's a hold-all name for unicellular eukaryotes. There have been advances with all of the new research with regard to RNA tracing, and the new research, it tends to cause a revamping of classifications, and that it basically is ongoing. But what you want to think about with regard to protists in terms of this image, which we'll talk about it again, is the various ways that protists can get nutrients in, and that they're also responsible for a portion of the energy cycle and the overall biospheres in their own right. So there are protists that have are phototropes, so protists that can photosynthesize. There are protists that actually will that are more fungus oriented and decomposers because of that. There are protists that eat many things, omnivores. There are protists that are parasites, as well as eating bacteria. So you have protists that use many different energy sources, have many different capacities to create energy, and because of that have a positive effect on the on everything, and certainly a positive effect for us. The structural diversity, protists exhibit more structural diversity than any other group of eukaryotes. They are more widely structurally and functionally diverse. As I said, nutrition-wise, you have heterotrophs, autotrophs, and then decomposers. You have autotrophs that can photosynthesize. So these are part of the eukaryotic group, but they can photosynthesize. You have protists that actually can consume other living things, like you have a paramecium eating here, and paramecium being eaten, I guess. And then you have decomposers, fungus-like decomposers, that again very useful in breaking down waste products. More of their complexity, not only with regard to what they can eat, but also their organelles. They function. They have their own unique function inside every individual cell. These organelles have their own unique function inside every cell, even if they're unicellular. So we think of organelles actually as they basically are active in each of our individual cells also. So it isn't that particular difference between protists and our cells. They can produce asexually. Think of binary fission, asexually or sexually. And so we talked about binary fission, but something's happening with the DNA with that, where you have full complement of DNA is being shared between the two cells. That's wonderful, and that allows for fast replication, but it doesn't allow for any diversity. And so protists can produce that way, or they can produce with regard to sexually, and this process called meiosis allows for there to be diversity just among that particular just among that particular plant to create an offspring that is different than itself. Also, as I said, the diversity with regard to nutrition. And then one other thing, when it comes to nutrition, you can have mixotrophs. That's a new word, mixotrophs. All the rest, the autotrophs, the heterotrophs we've talked about before. And with that, you have certain protists that combine photosynthesis and heterotrophic nutrition, and actually taking in organic matter. So a lot of diversity, and in terms of how energy can be consumed, also that's a huge functional diversity as to whether they can asexually reproduce or sexually reproduce. Here's the first time you'll see this slide, and one of the reasons why I have 5-4 supergroups is because if you're looking at any other source, you will more likely see 5 groups than 4. And what happens is that last group at the bottom, they tend to divide that into 2 groups. So you have the excavata, and we'll talk about all the. You have the SAR group, you have the algae group, and then the last group, which includes amoebas and also fungi, as well as animals. That particular group, many people divide into 2 different groups. So that's where you get that 4-5 idea. And as I said in the very beginning, there is some confusion because of that. That confusion is not going to carry over into your class nor your test. We're going with four supergroups because that's what your book goes with. And you will want to be able to identify each of the supergroups by name, and their names are very, very different, at least in a multiple choice test, as well as some of the types that are in those supergroups and their unique features. But their features are pretty unique, so that you won't have that hard of a time remembering one feature from another. I think the hardest thing, and you aren't going to be expected to learn how to spell, but the hardest thing is probably spelling, and even harder than that, pronouncing. Neither of which you are going to have to do. And the idea is all this goes back to a root ancestor. Therein lies the problem and the confusion, again, as we talked about last chapter, is there's so much genetic recombination that it's difficult to trace these back to a common ancestor. And again, we are tracing billions of years, so the technology to trace is not developed yet, but they have good theories about it, good scientific theories about it. So 4 supergroups. One other reason, I guess you might say, why there's confusing is this concept of endosymbiosis. There is considerable evidence that this is one of the reasons why there's so much diversity. Endosymbiosis is a relationship between 2 species where one organism lives inside another. So this kind of sounds wild and science fiction-y, but this is going on in your own body. Our mitochondria, that mighty mitochondria, the powerhouse, evolved from an aerobic prokaryote that somewhere along the line, the cells that became us ingested. So didn't ingest to eat, but took into their own cell. And that lineage, so the plastids from a photosynthetic cyanobacterium, that also was incorporated into red and green algae. The line that actually we'll talk about later in the chapter, red and green algae. But looking at the left at the pictures, you start with 2 independent bacteria. One bacteria engulfs the other, but doesn't digest it, doesn't break it apart. It actually lives inside the other. Now, with our mitochondria, which is living inside us, we actually bring it its oxygen in. We bring it its oxygen and bring its glucose in. So it's living inside us, actually, and very much incorporated into what we are. But we feed the oxygen to it. We also feed it glucose. It gives us our ATP, our source of energy. So it's symbiotic. That's where you get this idea of endosymbiotic. We are actually protecting those mitochondria. The mitochondria are giving us energy. So it's win-win on both parts. And then what happens is that particular whole structure, both bacteria benefit, and that's passed on from generation to generation. So much of this diversity is because of this concept of endosymbiosis. And then secondary endosymbiosis, where you have a particular living entity. You start with the cyanobacterium, and that then is going to ingest, but over a course of evolution loses membrane. I need to, actually I'm running out of time. I need to pick this up on the next one. I'm sorry about that.